So welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to this webinar, Connecting Vegetation Management and Cultural Ecosystem Services in Grid Planning. We're talking to you here from Berlin and Spain and a few other places, which you will learn in our introduction session in a second. There's still a lot of people joining, admitting at the same time. So anyway, I will start so we have more time for our precious speakers here today. So I would just like to give you a few housekeeping rules in the beginning. So my name is Annika Liljestam. I'm moderating today for you. I'm the coordinator of GINGR, the Global Initiative for Nature, Grids and Renewables. It would be nice if you could rename yourself to your name and your organization. And please, if you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to share them in the chat box. We will take them up later in the Q&A session. As you already noticed, the session is being recorded. If you speak, it's always nice to have your camera on if your bandwidth allows you to. Next, please. What we always ask people to do is it would be great to hear in the chat, and I think Abdullah has already done so. Please indicate your institution and where you're joining us from today, because this always helps us to understand a little bit where the target audience sits. So thanks for doing that with us. And then I would just briefly like to introduce you who we are. So as I said, I'm working for the Renewables Grid Initiative. We are a unique collaboration of transmission system operators and civil society organizations. You can see all the nice member logos here. So for around 17 years, RGI has worked to support the energy transition by promoting electricity grid deployment, which is not only efficient and reliable, but also environmentally responsible and socially inclusive. So what we do is we share knowledge products, we build capacity, and we advance approaches that support this just energy transition. And we are mainly working in Europe, but looking more and more around the globe. And this is how it came to GINGR. Next slide, please. So RGI, together with IUCN, has launched this global initiative for nature, grids, and renewables. We're working together with the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And what we do is we want to develop practical tools and methodologies that actually help integrate climate, biodiversity, and social objectives into the renewable energy infrastructure. We want to support project developers and other decision makers in planning, monitoring, and reporting. So in the long term, we want to bring benefits for nature and people. Next slide, please. We have recently had a number of webinars, and this one is part of this series called Connecting Energy, Nature and People, which is basically co-launched by RGI and GINGR together. It's the second in a row this year. The last one was on ecosystem accounting and grid planning. We have all the recordings available online, so have a look if you're interested in one of these topics. Next slide, please. So we're here with you today, though, to go into details on cultural ecosystem services and grid planning. As you all know, as electricity grids expand to support decarbonization, the question is really no longer simply where we build the infrastructure, but how we design and manage it. So it contributes positively to nature and people both. And much of today's discussion around nature-positive grids actually focuses on biodiversity and ecosystem services. But people actually experience these landscapes in many other ways. So through recreation, identity, cultural heritage, beauty, and attachment to place and well-being. And these are then often referred to as cultural ecosystem services. And this is what today's webinar is dealing with today. We want to understand how these values can be measured, understood, and also ultimately integrated into electricity grid planning. So we want to explore today, how can these cultural and relational values be understood and assessed more systematically? But also, what difference does that make in practice for grid planning, corridor management, and the long-term relationship between infrastructure and communities? And we are therefore very, very fortunate to have these great 4 speakers with us today, who will approach this question from different but very complementary angles. So first, Kim is joining us from the Center for Sustainable Transitions at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Isabella De Labre, she's a senior lecturer in environmental geography at the School of Social Sciences at Birkbeck, University of London, and Dr. Megan Garfinkel, who is an assistant professor at the Chicago State University. And last but not least, we have my dear colleague Adrian Mate from Spain. He's a colleague working with me on GINGR at the Renewables Grid Initiative. I also want to mention my other colleague, Adriana Saharoun. She is our comms manager, and she's also here if you have any questions. She's dealing with the chat today. So thanks to all my colleagues and the lovely speakers. And then we can have another look at the agenda. So we will first look at cultural ecosystem services in general. Then we want to understand how they can be integrated in grid planning with Isabella. And then Megan will run us through the vegetation management part of this session. And at the end, Adrian will make the connection to GINGR. And we have 25 minutes planned for the Q&A. And we are looking forward to an interesting discussion with all of you. So please share your questions in the chat. So this is my introduction, but now I would like to give the word to Kim. And she will start with a question of how cultural ecosystem services can actually be recognized and assessed in the context of infrastructure planning. And she will help us to unpack what kind of values we're looking at, why they might be often overlooked actually, and what kind of tools or approaches can help make them more visible in planning. So without further ado, Kim, you can share your slides if it works. And the floor would be yours. It's still black, but yeah, great. Thanks, Kim. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. As Anna mentioned, I work for the Center for Sustainability Transitions in South Africa, and my background is primarily in understanding cultural ecosystem services broadly. And just to set the scene a little bit about the ecosystem services concept, so it emerged as a way for translating really complex sort of life-supporting benefits that nature provides people into measurable and economic terms that help bridge the gap between science and policy, which was seen as quite critical at the time. And one of the major advances was the Millennium Ecosystem Service Assessment, which was released in 2005. And this really gave us a useful framework for helping us identify the different benefits nature provides people. And they had categorized them into 3 broad groups. So that includes provisioning, which refers to the material goods provided by nature. There's regulating, which refers to the benefits obtained from the regulation of ecosystem processes. And then finally, cultural, which are the non-material benefits people derive from nature. And these include benefits like recreation and tourism, aesthetic experiences, spiritual and religious benefits, sense of place, and identity and belonging. But based on their non-material nature, they have frequently been overlooked because they don't really conform to any sort of conventional metrics of evaluation. And this is really the challenge of evaluating cultural ecosystem services. So while the Millennium Ecosystem Service Assessment was trying to promote the economic metrics in order to increase visibility of ecosystem services in policy via direct economic evaluation, there were limitations around promoting an anthropocentric and utilitarian approach to nature, and that largely ignored the deeply entrenched relationship people had with nature and sort of treated the two as separate. So on the other side of that, there's more cultural-based metrics, which try to capture the non-material benefits that people derive from nature, but they can often be overlooked because, again, they don't conform to traditional economic quantifications and can be very subjective. So in recognition of this, the conversation expanded to move beyond ecosystem services framing toward the framing of nature's contributions to people. So where the ecosystem services approach put forward by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment looked at linking humans with the benefits nature provides, the nature's contributions to people framing, which was put forward by the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, developed a conceptual framework that allowed human-nature relationships to be explored more broadly and emphasized plural values, diverse worldviews, and cultural contexts. And the kind of nature's contributions to people, or NCPs, that they identified were material, non-material, and regulating. And critically, this framing explicitly recognizes that people experience and value nature quite differently. So a wetland in a rural community offers quite a different resource, water, than it would for an urban planner who looks at a wetland as a flood buffer, for example. But by putting values and specifically plural values central to this concept, it really enables us to look at the system as a whole. And this was formalized in a values assessment, which was released in 2023, which highlighted the importance of plural values and developed a really comprehensive typology for how we measure and value ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people. And for the purposes of my research, I've generally focused on specific values, and these encompass instrumental values, which refer to, the sort of nature as a resource, what can we get from it? Intrinsic values, which recognizes the importance of nature's existence in and of itself. And then relational values, which is the meaning we create in our relationship with nature. And it is also critical to note that these values often don't occur in isolation in reality. People can hold plural values across one singular ecosystem state. So for example, a forest might hold value for you because you appreciate the fact that there's timber provided, but also aesthetically it's really beautiful. Perhaps it reminds you of being a child and picnicking or playing in the forest. And also, you recognize its carbon sequestration potential. However, despite this broadening, there is still some gaps that persist. And we really still don't understand what shapes how people value ecosystems. And there's multiple facets of a human's identity that sort of is implicit in how they respond and how they value nature. And these are really embedded in their culture, their values, their beliefs, their knowledge, and their identity. But because these are sort of very specific and intrinsic parts of human identity, they are quite hard to measure and remain underrepresented in current assessments. And so, despite their importance, social cultural processes still remain invisible in how we assess nature. And so the remaining challenge persists of, even if we have tools to measure nature, why do people value nature differently? And how are values formed in the first place? And how do identity, worldview, and knowledge shape values? And we have had such important progression from ecosystem services to NCP to now sort of more integrated approaches, but we're not really equipped to understand the social cultural processes that produce these values, sort of the underlying criteria. And so in recognition of this, we produced an integrated framework for understanding social ecological interactions by sort of merging cultural ecosystem services with the nature's contributions to people approach and centered cultural ecosystem services. I don't have time to go into the details of this framework, but this is an open access paper if anyone wants to follow up. And we identified sort of 4 critical pillars of evaluating cultural ecosystem services. The first one being understanding co-production. And this refers to the interaction between social and ecological systems that generate benefits. So it's really recognizing that our relationship with nature is not unidirectional. It is a bidirectional process where nature produces things for people, but people also shape the conditions under which nature can produce those benefits. The next is co-construction, which highlights the interaction between individuals and their society that shapes the values they hold. So just recognizing that the way you see the world is filtered through your identity as it relates to your society. And this is really embedded in our social cultural context. So we know society is not one homogeneous group. There's multiple differences in how we relate to nature, and it's really driven by culture, identity, language, and knowledge systems. And these need to be implicit in how we evaluate cultural ecosystem services. And then just to close the loop, recognizing that human nature feedbacks really shape how we view nature. This is the idea that people influence ecosystems and ecosystems influence people. And understanding this is essential for effective governance. And so in the context of infrastructure planning, which is not my forte, but I'm giving it a bash. So we know that we can evaluate cultural ecosystem services. In the last 10 years, cultural ecosystem services has really expanded in the literature, and there are multiple ways to measure them. And so understanding what communities value is really important. There's both quantitative and qualitative approaches. So things like Likert scales and Q methodology can help you put a number to the value people place on cultural ecosystem services. And then qualitative approaches help us develop a narrative around these values. There's also ways to identify how those values vary according to how people identify, and importantly, enable the capturing of the multiple values that people hold for nature and not just prioritizing single metrics. It is then important to place those values in space, so identify where those values occur. So things like participatory mapping helps, or I suppose provides tools for communities to identify the places that matter to them. And this is really important for connecting those places and overlaying that with planners who are making decisions in those spaces. And then it also helps us recognize what in the environment people care about. Is it the species? Is it the community? Is it the landscape? Is it all of the above? And how that connects to people's social contexts. And then lastly, it's really important to embed values in planning and governance. So the framework we developed isn't just about describing differences in values, it's about explaining how they're formed. Part of this is identifying the feedbacks. We know that once people feel heard, they are more likely to promote environmental considerations that align with those values. And this includes things like well-being and place attachment. And once people if there's an intervention put forward in a system, if people see themselves in that intervention, and if they receive a reflection of their quality of life being produced through culturally grounded decisions, then it's more likely to promote stewardship of those systems. And so my last slide, just to reiterate that cultural values can be mapped and measured and assessed. And we need to put more importance on revealing how communities experience landscapes by promoting integrated frameworks and identifying the social cultural processes that underpin those values. So not just what people value, but why and how those differences shape the relationship between communities and their environment. And as concepts, these can help support nature positive infrastructure planning and governance that better reflect community well-being, place attachment, and long-term stewardship of ecological systems. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim. Great. Actually, I have one follow-up question also to your last slide, if possible, because I mean, this is a great message. So we know it's measurable and we can map it. So you argued that this is all possible, but you mentioned these 3 steps, the last one being the integration. So which of these 3 steps do you think is currently the biggest challenge in practice? So is it measuring, is it mapping, or actually ensuring that these values are actually influencing decisions? Because it's quite a new topic, as you already said. So I don't know, can you already say this, or is it too new to say?
I mean, they're all very intertwined. So disentangling them from each other in terms of which is the hardest is, I suppose, not an easy question to answer, but there are elements of each step that are extremely challenging. So for example, trying to disaggregate ecosystem users according to their identity to try and understand what they want from an ecosystem or how an ecosystem can best service them is in itself quite challenging. And then being able to integrate that message in infrastructure and development planning as the final step is also a really difficult process. But from my experience, if a community feels heard, if they feel like their values are reflected in any interventions that occur, they're more likely to be supported by the community.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much, Kim. I think this is a great transition to our next speaker, Isabella, because you want to tell us a little bit on once we have made these values visible, actually, how do they actually influence planning and governance? and how can we do this in a meaningful way? So we're looking forward to hear from you, Isabella. I would say, one more thing for the newcomers on the call. So if you have questions in between, please place them in the chat box so we can take them up in the Q&A later. Also, if there are questions on clarification, we can also take them right after each presentation from the speakers. So without further ado, Isabella, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Hi, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, so I'm going to be talking about making the invisible visible and how to integrate cultural ecosystem services into grid planning. So previous research that we've undertaken examines the application of cultural ecosystem services to support inclusive and effective nature-based solutions. So here I'm going to be applying this research to examine the question of how can ecological and inclusive electricity grid planning support sustainable multifunctional landscapes. And these are some of the papers we've done around this with teams at the University of Sussex. So yeah, by way of content, so I'll first just touch on the framings of cultural ecosystem services, picking up on what Kim so nicely put forward previously. Then I'll discuss the benefits of broader cultural ecosystem services perspectives for nature-based solutions and grid planning, and highlight some of the things that we communicated in one of the papers. Then connect this to multifunctional land use mapping and modelling. And then finally, I'd like to conclude with some reflections on the importance of engaging with complexity. So these are some of the framings of cultural ecosystem services. So there's this initial sort of Millennium Ecosystem Assessment definition of cultural ecosystem services as the non-material benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. But there's been this shift towards more relational or broader perspectives, which is what we refer to in our paper. So we're seeing cultural ecosystems as being thought of as relational processes and entities that people actively create and express through interactions with ecosystems. And it's moving away from a stock and flow framing of people-nature relationships to ideas of reciprocity, so what people derive from and co-produce with nature. And it also moves towards relational values and recognizing these such as care, responsibility, and reciprocity, as well as social cultural values, shared plural and cultural values, and intrinsic values. So we've seen this shift, and we examined how these framings of cultural ecosystem services have been applied to research into sustainable land use planning to date. So when we examined research.
I think you're on mute, Isabella.
Okay, since when? Since this slide? Shall I start this
No,
slide?
just was one sentence, I
Oh,
think.
was it? Okay. So when we shifted away from this, so we've seen this shift away from a relational approach. So when we looked at the values recognized in the instrumental approaches to research, they were able to capture aesthetic values and recreational values. But when research looked at relational approaches, they were able to capture more values. So aesthetic values, spiritual and religious values, sense of place, cultural heritage values, and shared and collective values. And they often used methods in combination with each other to recognize these broader values at play here that people were putting forward. So it's not so much the methods that we use, but how they're used in combination with each other to sort of address the different aspects of the questions. So previously in instrumental approaches to sustainable land use planning research, the lots of methods would be around monetary analysis and willingness to pay. They'd use spatial models, they'd use participatory multi-criteria decision analysis, participatory GIS, and models of future change. Whereas with the relational approach, the research was using things like open-ended questions and ethnographic approaches, community voice methods in combination with multi-criteria approaches in deliberative democratic process. They'd also use deliberative monetary valuation in combination with participatory systems modelling and participatory mapping, as well as public participatory GIS. But the most important difference between this was the way in which the research questions are formulated and pursued, rather than, any one method being good or bad. It's more how they're used in combination with each other to develop all of these and to understand and reveal these complex values at work here. So moving on, I'd like to just highlight some benefits of broader cultural ecosystem services perspectives for implementing effective and equitable nature-based solutions. That's from our research, and apply this and think about how this might be applied to grid planning. So the first benefit we found in our research was that a broader cultural ecosystem services approach could make visible a wide range of local values which are not seen in mainstream international cultural ecosystem services frameworks. And making local values visible supports context-specific nature-based solutions implementation and grid planning. There are interpretive methods for understanding dimensions like emotions, connectedness, authenticity, and spirituality that are often overlooked in current practices. And a diverse range of values is therefore ignored in nature-based solutions policy making, which risks undermining policy's effectiveness. A second benefit that we found was that a broader cultural ecosystem services approach can help to recognise the interconnectedness of the nature-human system and facilitate the co-production of mutual benefits. And here there's a need to move towards a more integrated approach that considers the reciprocal influence between ecosystems and humans, and establish monitoring and reporting frameworks that encompass natural and human systems and human-nature interactions. A third benefit from our work found that was that a broader cultural ecosystem services approach can help to create a co-learning space to support the integration of different types of knowledge and worldviews. So policies and practices could adopt a knowledge co-production approach, which means understanding local people's lived experiences, religious and ritual systems, and subsistence needs, and creating a space for learning about cultural processes, conflicts, and impacts at different scales can support more equitable, inclusive, effective, and innovative policies and solutions. A fourth benefit of a broader CES approach can support the development of more just and equitable strategies for conservation. We found that transcendent and shared values can emerge. These processes can build trust between participants. They can better understand conflicting interests and define actions to meet both ecological and community needs. And local cultural values can then support more equitable planning processes and facilitate effective conservation outcomes. And these lessons can be brought into planning for nature-based solutions and grid planning. And finally, the fifth benefit is that a broader CES approach can support the active role of local communities in nature recovery and environmental governance. And this broader CES approach could facilitate a paradigm shift in landscape governance and management towards a more integrated approach that promotes the care of the landscape as a whole and encourages the active role of the community in restoring nature. But despite this need for integrated approaches, the dominant perspective of policy and planning remains to consider land use issues in isolation. So I also wanted to highlight that there are tools that can support this work and bring these together at the landscape level. And here, things like flexible participatory landscape modelling platforms, such as that LEMA developed by the University of Sussex, can support sustainable multifunctional landscapes. So what's really interesting here is that it draws on emerging scientific evidence and data in real time. And it's a flexible platform that can take in all different kinds of data, not just quantitative, but qualitative data, and looks for appropriate ways to represent local knowledges. And these need to be sort of contextually appropriate, and it really encourages sort of local participation in the use of these mapping and modelling platforms. So the tool itself sort of becomes a point for communities to get involved in land use mapping and modelling, and really thinking about what landscapes look like and what land use should include. Such platforms can also identify priority evidence gaps to be filled. So where is there uncertainty? Where is more information needed? And these platforms can also be used for knowledge dissemination and reflective and adaptive participatory decision making. And finally, I just wanted to conclude with this need to engage with complexity here. So we've found in our work that policy has not kept up with more progressive cultural ecosystem services framings, and we think that these intangible aspects of cultural ecosystem services may be seen as too complex to apply in practice. But it's really important to have this deeper engagement with broader cultural ecosystem services perspectives to actually support more effective and inclusive interventions. Collaborative research with local communities also enables more inclusive monitoring and reporting, and an application of a broad cultural ecosystem services approach into grid planning could even be really helpful in bridging the disconnection between technical perspectives and critical social sciences approaches to cultural ecosystem services and nature-based solutions. So thank you very much for listening, and yeah, really delighted to be part of this discussion.
Thanks, Isabella. Really interesting. So I already learned a lot here. Just one follow-up question for you, if it's okay. So you're saying that actually policy is not keeping pace with this more progressive understanding. And yes, it seems very complex. But do you have examples, or do you know if they're at least trying to deal with this complexity? I mean, because if I see, religious, spirituality, emotions, these kind of things, very hard to measure. But have you seen that there are at least attempts to move forward with this?
Yeah, so these sorts of examples of it being used in a progressive way can be seen in a few examples that we highlight in our paper. But these are really seen in the way that in research rather than in practice. But there are a few case studies like the Sundarbans Nature Reserve, where there are more sort of holistic ways of dealing with cultural ecosystem services and thinking about sort of the multiple values that can be identified through those practices. But it's more that it's happening within research circles rather than in practice. What we found for the UK is that cultural ecosystem services are only are being mentioned in policy, but it's the very instrumental framing still. So our sort of recommendation is to open up those ideas of cultural ecosystem services, widen the scope, and to really capture a wider perspective of people's values, because otherwise they'll get sidelined, and then we'll have potentially risk some of the issues that came up with green grabbing and other sort of not equitable or effective climate solutions.
Okay, interesting. Thanks so much. Adrian, a follow-up question or?
Yeah, I was gonna say thanks, Isabella. I think another example perhaps is the one in the UK. In the UK, they have this thing called the biodiversity net gain, whereby each developer, they need to, let's say, promise 10% of biodiversity net gain in any action they do, whether it's real estate, grids, or agriculture or farming. And they measure this with their own tools, the DIFRA metrics toolbox and things like this. But they're also starting to incorporate cultural ecosystem services with a subvariant tool called the EVN tool, which they also are starting to use to assess these kind of things. And as she said, this is still staying not in the in the policy context. This is almost getting there, but we are shaping, I think, together within different geographies, the need to incorporate these elements into policy making. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. So now we move from planning and governance perspective to a very concrete infrastructure context, vegetation management in grid corridors. So this is particularly interesting lens because it shows how day-to-day management choices can shape not only the ecological outcomes, but also how communities perceive this infrastructure. And how they trust the operators and relate to these landscapes over time. So I'm very glad that we have Megan Garfinkel on the call today, on the webinar today, to present her views from the US. So thanks, Megan. I will give the word to you. And we're good on time, so there's no need to rush through anything.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm so pleased to be here and tell you a little bit about my project. So as you mentioned, this is a little bit more of a concrete talk, and I'm going to be telling you about a project I worked on several years back now, looking at different types of ecosystem services that are provided by electricity grid corridors, specifically in residential landscapes. Our greater project, we focused on several different types of ecosystem services. So for instance, pollination, but today, of course, I'm going to be focusing on just talking about some of those cultural ecosystem services that we've been talking about. So this project was actually funded through a grant from our local electric utility company, Commonwealth Edison. And so we were able to get information from them, work with them, but I will say that they had no input on any of our results, the conclusions that we drew, or how we communicate those results. Okay, so just to orient you all to where this study took place, this was in northern Illinois in the United States, so in the area around Chicago here on the shore of Lake Michigan, which is the third largest city in the United States. And so Commonwealth Edison, or ComEd, the utility company, is actually one of the largest landowners in Illinois. You can see in this map the location in yellow of several of their electricity transmission lines, and they actually operate over 22,600 hectares of rights-of-way. In this presentation, I just used this abbreviation ROW for right-of-way. I know people have different terminology for this. I'm going to call it a right-of-way corridor. We're talking about those high-voltage electric overhead power lines. And so of these, over 220 hectares are maintained as prairie habitat. So a little background on prairie, why this is interesting in our area. Prairie is an extremely endangered type of grassland in the Midwest area of the United States, just like grasslands are worldwide. In Illinois specifically, less than 0.01% of the original tall grass prairie is remaining. So you can see this map from the early 1800s. Everything in this sort of tannish color would have been prairie or grassland. And in this present day map, it's basically all replaced by agriculture, mostly corn and soybean agriculture. And you can see, of course, here in pink, that's that developed area, Chicago and the greater Chicago metropolitan area. So we'll come back to prairie in a moment. I just want to give some context why prairie is important in this region. So we were interested in rights-of-ways in residential areas because we know that they can provide a significant or a substantial source of green space in residential regions. And specifically, we wanted to know what kinds of ecosystem services do these rights of ways provide to people that are living nearby them? As I mentioned, we were looking at things like pollination services and other ecosystem services, but in general, we were interested in this framework of how they act as green space that provides ecosystem services. So we went out and we looked at the right-of-way corridors in these residential areas, and we figured out that they're really managed in one of three different ways in our region. It's done a little bit differently in the agricultural areas, but in residential areas, we have these three vegetation management categories. So in some cases, we call this category mown, where it's managed as turf grass, so it's mowed fairly frequently throughout the growing season. It does take a fair bit of effort in vegetation management because they do have to go out and repeatedly mow that. Excuse me. The default management is what we call old field, and this is where they manage on a 5-year cycle to go in and remove that woody vegetation. They might go in years in between and do some herbiciding for select areas. But what you end up with is this vegetation, which might be pretty thick herbaceous vegetation, pretty weedy, and it often has a lot of invasive plant species. And then prairie corridors are either in cases where there are remnant prairies, or more often they are restored prairies. So someone has gone in, they've seeded the site, and then they might manage with prescribed burns, selected herbicide treatments, things like that in order to manage for native prairie vegetation. And so we wanted to know how this management approach, how these three different management approaches affected the various types of ecosystem services that these rights of way were providing. And our goal was basically to be able to provide recommendations about best practices for management in order to maximize ecosystem services. So just really briefly, so you understand the study design, we had several criteria for our study sites. We wanted to find locations where we had clusters of all three different management types of corridors nearby. All of these right-of-way corridors we were using as study sites had to be in residential areas and have at least one long edge that had housing along it. And so we were able to find these 4 different locations where we had clusters of study sites. And you can see that some of them are in sort of closer to the city area. Some of them are more suburban, slightly urban. Some of them are more small town residential. And so we had a total of these 12 corridor sites. This is, of course, a relatively small sample size. And so we'll have to keep that in mind when we are drawing conclusions from our results. So our first step was to just survey what type of biodiversity was found at these different types of sites. So we wanted to know, how does the management category affect biodiversity? We went out and we did some surveys for birds at all of these sites, pollinating insects, plants, and my training is as an ornithologist, so of course I have to show this adorable American woodcock chick, which was from one of the prairie sites. So they do have some interesting biodiversity. These are the well-camouflaged chicks in this smaller picture. And I think it'll probably come as no surprise to anyone that we have this continuum of biodiversity, where these prairie sites have the highest biodiversity among these 3 different taxonomic groups. And then those mowed sites were relatively low in comparison. The old field sites were interesting because they actually did have relatively high levels of biodiversity, but that did include generally some invasive species for amongst all of the 3 different taxa. So in terms of native biodiversity, really maximized in those prairie sites. This paper is, I believe, open access, and I think these slides are going to be available later on. So if you want to use the QR code and read more about this part of the project, you can find that there. Okay, so moving on to the meat of the event, the cultural ecosystem services. We were really interested in learning about them for a couple of different reasons. First, when we were out doing our surveys, we saw people were using the rights of ways in really interesting ways. So here in this picture on the left, you can see someone's had a load of gravel dumped onto the site. They've mowed an area and they've got some seeding, and they're using it as an extension of their yard. And then in several different sites, we saw people would have gardens, some smaller, some larger. You can see this garden area is being planted. So we wanted to learn more about that. But we also had this information from the Commonwealth Edison Company that one of the reasons that they convert a right-of-way to that mode category is if they've received complaints about vegetation from people living nearby. And so together, we wanted to know, are there trade-offs in the types of ecosystem services that are maximized by these different management categories? In other words, why would they put in the effort to create these mode rights of ways if they're not, it takes a lot of effort. They have to have people going out and doing that fairly frequently. Clearly, it doesn't maximize biodiversity. So our hypothesis was maybe this is those mode sites are something that are preferred by people for cultural ecosystem services. So maybe they provide a recreational opportunity. Maybe people prefer the aesthetics of that mode sort of clean look. And so we wanted to learn more about this. So we created a survey that we gave to people that were living by the rights of ways that we were looking at. It asked several different questions. I don't have time to go over all of this here, but again, there's a link to the paper with more details. But these surveys talked about or asked about how people use the right of way, their feelings about the rights of ways, the services and disservices that they think that they would provide, general feelings about nature, some open-ended questions. We asked if they had made a formal complaint about vegetation, and some demographics questions. And so we distributed the surveys to 212 households. Again, every single household that was directly adjacent to one of those corridor sites. The surveys were given either online or in person, and we had about a 31% completion rate. So again, we need to keep in mind that this is a relatively low sample size. We need to be cautious about how we generalize these results, but I still think that we found some fairly interesting patterns from these surveys. So first, when we asked about how people actually use the right-of-way that's next to their home, the most commonly reported way of using it was for wildlife observation. So over 20% of people had mentioned that they do some sort of wildlife observation. This might be watching birds or butterflies, deer, coyotes, things like that. In these next couple of slides, I'm going to show the responses from people separated out by what type of corridor they lived by. So the top row, we've got people living by the prairie, the old field, or the mode corridors. And then we've separated out their responses based on, so here, this red is strongly disagree to dark blue is strongly agree. So for this statement, I'm happy with the way ComEd maintains vegetation by the right-of-way by my house. There was no difference in how people responded to this statement based on what type of corridor they lived at. So this is sort of some evidence against this idea that people prefer mode corridors. And interestingly, for the statement, the right-of-way is aesthetically pleasing or attractive, we actually found that people living by the mode corridors were more likely to strongly disagree with this statement. This was a statistically significant difference here. So again, more evidence that people don't seem to prefer these mode corridors. And finally, for the statement, tall grass and vegetation looks untidy in a right-of-way, we had a very strong difference here in people that were living by these prairie-managed corridors, where they were much more likely to disagree with this statement. So either the aesthetics of people that live by these prairies differ from those that live by different types of corridors, or the types of tall vegetation that they're used to seeing. So this native tall grass prairie type vegetation is more aesthetically appealing to them. Either way, it's an interesting result here that I think begs some more study to learn about why people prefer the things that they do in terms of aesthetics. So this evidence is suggesting that people don't necessarily, as a whole, prefer these mode sites. But despite this evidence, we did find some interesting, just anecdotal things where, for instance, these two pictures are of the same prairie right-of-way. You can see the power line, the lines up ahead. This is a sign that says, "Do not disturb." It's from ComEd. It explains that this is a prairie site. And you can see that the whole area behind it has been mowed by the homeowner. And here's a path that that homeowner has mowed right through that prairie. Again, both the same sites. So again, despite the evidence that doesn't seem that people prefer a completely mowed site, clearly they are getting some sort of benefit from having patches mowed. And so again, this is an area where we need to dig a little bit deeper and sort of unpack the reasons why people are doing this sort of guerrilla management on their own. And this might also mean that there's an opportunity to provide more education about the importance of prairies. And I apologize, I know I am going a little bit long, just a couple more slides here. So a couple of key findings, both the results that I showed you and a couple of results that I haven't showed you, but some summarized results from this survey. Again, we found that wildlife observation was the most frequently reported activity that people used the right-of-way for. We found that residents near these mowed right-of-ways were significantly less likely to find the right-of-way attractive. And we found also that most respondents believe it's important that the right-of-way provides habitat for wildlife. So this was one of the questions we asked about, what do you think that the right-of-way should be used for? And finally, the management category didn't actually affect the probability of formal complaints, so whether or not someone had complained to ComEd about the vegetation that was there. So again, all evidence suggesting that people probably, or as a whole, people don't seem to prefer these mowed corridors for cultural ecosystem services. So we can conclude that managing for human enjoyment does seem to, at least in this region, be compatible with managing for biodiversity, and that managing for biodiversity actually can enhance some of these cultural services in residential rights-of-ways, especially as people prefer some of those aesthetics that are associated with these high biodiversity areas like the prairies, and also because it provides these opportunities for people to watch wildlife in right behind their own homes. And I do want to acknowledge my three collaborators for this project, Dr. Hostler, Dr. Miner, and Dr. Whalen. All right, so thank you so much for giving me some time to tell you about this project.
Thank you so much, Meg. Very, very interesting. I'm really keen to understand a little bit more. Maybe that's interesting for a lot of the people in the audience today, I assume, are not from America or the US, so we are not so familiar with the concept or the landscape prairie. I mean, we've all heard about it, but I was very, very surprised to hear that 0.01% is in Illinois. Is this the same in the whole Midwest where the prairie is actually placed? That would be interesting. And also, I would like to understand, do people make the connection, or are they aware that this is something that needs to be pushed, that we need to fight, that prairies are so endangered? Like, is there a movement for more biodiversity or going back to original state of nature in the prairies? And is this then why they accept something like this rights of way in a prairie format more?
I think they're definitely different groups. So there's still this preference across a lot of the United States for these very sterile looking lawns. But there's also pushback against that. So at least in my region, there are lots of groups where people are educating each other about native prairie plants just for their lawn plantings, things like that. In terms of your first question about is this prairie rare across the entire Midwest? It is pretty rare, just because agriculture is, these areas are relatively flat. And even if the soils aren't great for agriculture, now that we have inputs for that, that isn't really an issue. So the fact that we've got these large, vast, flat areas, we get these seas of corn and soybeans. So that's pretty common. Um, your other question, I'm sorry, was related to.
If they make this connection to saving prairies in a way, or is there a movement to save prairies or to come back to more prairies or increase the number of prairies and making this connection to grid corridors?
Yeah, so I think that there are some people that are sort of in a save prairie direction. I would say that pollinators have great PR. And so not necessarily the prairie itself, but there's a lot of people that really want to save the pollinators. And so because these prairies are great habitat for pollinators, that's sort of a direction that we've been pushing. One of the parts of our study was to look at how these different management approaches affected pollinators. And so if you can show this type of management is great for pollinators, especially charismatic ones like the monarch butterfly, things like that, I think you can really get a little more attention, rather than just talking about prairie as a habitat that's endangered.
Okay, cool, thanks. Just a little advertisement. We had an interesting webinar on the pollinator corridors in December. You can find it on our recording space on GINGR. Maybe Adriana, you can put a link in the chat. So thanks so much. We are a little bit over time, but I think that's fine. So we now heard about why cultural values matter, how they can be understood and seen. We learned about a practical example from residential transmission corridors. The final question for me is how can these insights actually become part of routine infrastructure planning? And this is sort of the connection to GINGR, I would say. So I'm giving the word to Adrian for his final presentation. And then we can dive into the discussion after this. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Annika. I hope that you can see the slides properly. Good. So basically, I would like to thank the three of you, Kim, Isabella, and Megan, to be present here today and explain within your own words, which are much better than mine, how the cultural ecosystem services are so important within grid planning. And this is part of the methodology that we are developing within GINGR. But for those that you are not aware of GINGR, we think that we are shifting the way of perceiving grids. Grids are not just wires, and we are now calling them a socio-ecological system, which is a concept which is also brought in by other, I would say, disciplines and in sectors and industries. And we see that grids are a multifunctional landscape, as Isabella said before, where a lot of things are happening. So just not only biodiversity is happening, ecosystem services, the three of them, the cultural values, but we know that unless we care for people, we would not be able to deliver, excuse me, the grids as fast as we want. And this is a learned lesson because I am actually here at the airport in Madrid, where we presented a little bit of this methodology to the Spanish TSO. And now they feel the importance and the need of incorporating cultural ecosystem services and measuring them within their grid planning process. And to do so as early as possible is also critical. When it comes to GINGR and our linear infrastructure technical working group, we've made this group following the fashion of RGI. So at RGI, or GINGR, we convene, we orchestrate the communication among all these players here. But we have one side the NGOs, so we've got some very famous, I would say, agents such as BirdLife International. We've got like a small RGI in Australia called Realliance, and some Chinese as the Shanshui Servicing Center, and a Spanish NGO more on the social and biodiversity and participation side of things. So we cover the public participation processes with them. That means the inclusiveness, the well-being, the energy equity, the systemic equity of making a just transition. When it comes to the corporation and academia, we've got different groups there. We are relying a lot on spatial analysis and how this is being represented. So we've got corporations which are very strong on doing so, such as Geolytics in Switzerland, and also the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. They excel in terms of mapping and measuring with metrics and mathematical models throughout the different life cycle, the lifespan of the asset, how grids are affected in terms of biodiversity and people. Captain Project is a spin-off from Zurich University, ETH Zurich University, and they are covering AI, so filling the gaps that we are not seeing from spatial data through AI. And TERI, it's a global institution, research center in India, that they touch in different things such as in GIS, forestry, biodiversity, participatory mapping, and so on. When it comes to the TSOs, we are increasing every day the members that are interested to join in our group. So recently we've incorporated redes. I think they're here today in the meeting room. And also we've got Redella, where as I said before, I was with them this morning. But we have also the 50 Hz Celia group, which I've seen also in the room, Statnet in Norway, Transpower in New Zealand, Eswatini and Niger in Niger, as well as Katarina, which I think I saw you as well in the room today. Ren are the TSO in Portugal. At last, we also would like to thank the collaboration we have with different institutions such as the UN Environmental Programme, the World Conservation Monitoring Center, based in the UK, but it's an international organization, as well as the IUCN, which glad you're here also from Bangladesh representing them, and Renew, which is another private corporation, very much to do with the biodiversity net gain, and that may relate a little bit with one of the questions which were asked in the room today. As it was said, IBM to me is the best example to explain why grids are so good, not only bad. I mean, they create benefits, not just impact. They can be great connectors for ecological connectivity or landscape connectivity, even as they span throughout thousands of kilometers. We had this webinar, which was announced by Annika, where we presented the opportunity to talk to the owners of the land underneath the right of way, underneath the power line, the right of way, where the Fingrid, the TSO in Finland, they propose bee farming activities, beekeeping activities, and they even pay them through this law. And that answers one of the questions that it was asked already in the chat. And then at last, I take my daughter. This is not a high voltage. This power line is a low voltage one. It's a medium voltage actually. But I take my daughter for horse riding. Well, at least see the horses because too young to do horse riding. In this school where I live, and this is just underneath the power line. So let's use this space wisely, as it has lots of benefits. Few these benefits, I would say, if they are wisely planned. Back to the framework, back to the methodology. We are developing it. We are now. It's written. We have to. It's draft. We have to pass it first within a quick screening within our own organization, and then we will send it across the members of the linear group for further comments. Basically, methodology support the co-design of grids with the people during all phases, but especially this is an iterative process. So those decisions that are taken in the early stage, they should be monitored so you can actually understand that these IBM solutions or the use of local knowledge or the use of certain species or plant species or vegetation management has been done properly and is being kept throughout the lifespan of the asset, not just to tick the box of the environmental impact assessment and nothing happens afterwards. That creates the negative impact of grids, not the positive impact of grids. And this is what we advocate for. At last, as we can represent everything in a spatial format, this is informative for the public engagement processes, public participation processes, sorry, as well as for the regulators, the decision makers, the ones that are passing the laws within our respective countries, as well as when you need to report as a TSO to the government or to your even to the green bond which was given to you as you proved you are a green delivery of green assets. The methodology is basically explained into this changing slide. So we have a number of steps which we would need to take forward. We use a mix of top-down and bottom-up approaches where we combine spatial analysis with field samples, and we incorporate everything which has been said here, such as the cultural values, the meanings, the ecosystem relationships, as well as the equity side of things, the vulnerability concepts, the inclusiveness, as Isabella earlier mentioned as well. Everything within one single framework. And when we talk about frameworks, I highlight the importance of Kim's work, because just talking about CES, cultural ecosystem services, without a framework is a nightmare. You need a framework to walk you through the process of understanding cultural ecosystem services only. And this is why I brought them, all of them, here today to help me explain this. Then these steps are complemented by what we call it the knowledge layers. And these knowledge layers are 4. So we touch on things such as biodiversity, landscape, and territorial baseline assessments. We would then ground truth this with field data. And we would monitor this periodically, so we make sure that everything that has been measured every 5 years is still there or has gone, or what happens. And that also adds on the two other layers. One of them, which is the one discussed today, and the second one, which is ecosystem service justice or equity, systemic equity into this just transition. So we have this series of steps. Together with the knowledge layers, to be able to bring our pillars, which are, you need to have ecosystem integrity, you need to make sure the social and cultural justice is being at least mapped or at least understood and communicated and monitored throughout your project. Of course, this adaptive spatial intelligence is necessary. As we work, we can explain things much easier with a map rather than with formulas or mathematical models. And then the governance, how we basically put this into practice, with whom, and that would be the last pillar. When we think about this methodology, I think also of passing some exams as if we were in school. And to do so, we need to have like an independent, let's say, board within the methodology itself. So this independent board is the evaluation architecture, which would then keep on asking questions and using specific metrics to make sure that we are not missing anything and not leaving anyone behind during the process. This is a continuous evaluation architecture, that this is the final outcome to deliver the socio-ecological performance that we need to deliver to the communities and the nature through time. And then on the bottom side this is also being applied through the different milestones in the lifespan of the asset, from the strategic environmental impact assessment. From the strategic environmental assessment towards the corridor definition to the environmental impact assessment, and then you move into the real project through permitting, through the final technical solution, through the different public consultations that are back and forth until the final construction permit is given, operation then kicks in, and then the lifespan of the asset will last for 40 years. So you need to make sure that what you leave afterwards is at least better or at least equal to your status quo, I would say. I have used this simulated image, which is coming from one of the IBM pictures of our working group at RGI, where we disaggregate the landscape, so we can simulate how on a spatial explanation we can map things such as landscape connectivity of power lines, so we can connect one corridor, one nature reserve from A to B. We can also understand what would be the impact on properties, on the land use, as Megan said before. What would be the value of our property if cultural ecosystem services are not taken into account? We may have a power line next to our house, and that's not nice unless we have been told to do so, and unless this TSO brings us more than just right of way or vegetation management to our property next to the grid. Then on the right side, we've got again the 4 layers which I've described before, the knowledge layers represented into different items. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the idea is to assess the ecological potential of the landscape using these spatial models, and to use some specific landscape ecological metrics so we can understand these things much better. When it comes to layer 2, we need to provide empirical evidence. So when we see a dense canopy, as seen in the picture from the left, from space, then we go to when we do a summer or field service, and nothing which has been identified on a spatial format is actually there. So we need to use camera traps. You need to use vegetation structure, the bioacoustics. We need to measure mammals, amphibians, reptiles, pollinators, a lot of things. And in terms of knowledge layer 3, I don't think I need to go through this because it has already been said. But there is one important thing, and in the UK, there is this thing called Tranquility Map. And I think it's very, very, very interesting. And I would recommend for some of you to look into this, because the Tranquility Map is actually very much representative of what a proper grid planning could be envisaged as one potential solution. The last layer is coming into also another webinar after summer, after vacation, and we were going to touch a lot of things about participatory GIS to measure social vulnerability, ecosystem service justice, but also in terms of using social media. So what happens when there is no data, when there are no surveys, but we have people taking pictures from places where we can map different types of demographics as well as different types of uses, and that's fitting into the layer 3 as well. So the idea is to identify landscape characteristics to create this potential for cultural ecosystem services to happen. And as a reminder, species richness, so no more flowers and no more lots of flowers or lots of bees doesn't mean that we would be contributing to seas, to cultural ecosystem services, solely. So we need to have a combination of different taxonomic groups to actually make sure that the vulnerable nature and the community are not prejudiced, if that's the right word in English. And then as outcomes, these are these heat maps that we may be able to identify these hotspots in our grid planning. So TSOs can use this methodology to understand where they should go and talk to the public, measure specific things, and understand better also the energy and the equity side of things that matters to grid planners. This is very important, not just in terms of delivering quicker or faster grids, but also for reporting, for the I think it's already old school social license, and I think this social license has already evolved as we are working on this. But yeah, this is the way to perhaps take a longer time, the planning stage, but then win the battles when there are litigations, when there are delays, when there are further processes that put your grids in danger. Yeah.
Just sorry, I think we should leave some time for the people to ask questions and discuss. So
I think it's my slide, so it's fine.
okay. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Annika.
Okay, so thanks, Adrian. So thanks for this. There is more to come from Adrian and the Linear Infrastructure Working Group. Also, if you're from a TSO today and you want to learn more, feel free to get in touch with us, info@ginger.org, or with Adrian directly. So I would actually like to start the Q&A session now. We've already had some questions in the chat, but what we've heard really a lot of interesting input today. And we already received one question from the audience before during the registration. And actually, I think it goes to the heart of what we are discussing here today. And the question is, how do we bridge the gap between landscape scale spatial planning and local participatory approaches? So basically, in other words, how do we make sure broad planning decisions still reflect the values of individual communities, in fact? So not looking at large scale, but the individual communities. So maybe Isabella, you would like to start with this?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's a great question, and I guess it always comes up, right? You know, you might be able to find really in-depth data about a local community, and but yeah, how does that connect with the landscape scale and with effective, sustainable, multifunctional landscape planning? So I think key here is transparent and open source mapping and modeling, and allowing those participatory processes to be connected with those sorts of mapping processes, so that people feel not just heard, but they are actually sort of involved in providing data that will be able to support more flexible, more adaptive decision making in relation to landscape planning. Yeah, I think using things like flexible tools, I've always been a bit wary of those, but I think they're actually really important when they're not sort of being used in an extractive way, but rather in a way that is connected to a process of like citizen empowerment. So you're not just extracting data from a community, but you're connecting them up with something very actionable and real. And I think Adrian said something quite interesting about sort of collaboration for future planning, and that a way of sort of engaging with communities in a way that helps them to think about their futures and sort of put them in the driving seat, really, and seeing them as partners rather than stakeholders.
Thanks, Isabella. Anyone from the speakers wants to add something on this? Otherwise, I would move to a next question.
So I would like to, but I think my camera might be malfunctioning. I'm not sure if you can see me.
No, we don't, but we hear you well, so it's fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, I totally endorse what Isabella said. But also just to reiterate that landscape planning is extremely complex when you're operating at a broad spatial scale, but when cultural values are generated at a local scale and are highly context specific. Having said that, though, and this is, I suppose, anecdotal, but from my research, we found that you can evaluate essentially the cultural ecosystem services that are generated at the landscape scale. So things like distance to water, high elevation, etc. There are mapping skills that can help us understand how cultural ecosystem services are generated.
Okay, thanks. But then in a way, it's really hard to say because people experience the same landscape very differently, right? So this does mean there can never be a single best solution for managing transmission corridors. And management always needs to be locally adapted, right? Or, okay. We have a long question from Abdullah in the chat from Bangladesh, saying that Bangladesh relies heavily on community-based natural resource management and local adaptation strategies. Maybe Abdullah, you want to show or you want to speak directly because it's quite long. You want to explain a little bit more. Feel free to unmute yourself if that's easier. If not, I would just, are you still here? Okay, but then maybe, so the question is, how can power companies in Bangladesh move towards a payment for ecosystem services model? In particular, how can we encourage local and indigenous communities to manage trees along transmission lines? So the tree felling becomes a cultural and economic asset rather than a cause for conflict. Any thoughts, Adrian, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I have seen this also in Mauritania when I worked there, and I see a lot of the timber uses when it comes to right-of-ways, and there are conflicts always there. There are sometimes as well sacred forests where this is not where these conflicts are not happening because they are sacred, so no one touches the vegetation of the trees. But I think the answer could be first on the evaluation techniques that you use for cultural ecosystem services. So you apply those in that specific case in Bangladesh, and then you may use also perhaps the examples we have seen with Fingrid in Finland, where depending on the context, maybe land use or land ownership may be public or private land that may be different. You may have the possibility to pay for vegetation management, to pay for beekeeping services in the case of Finland, and things like that. That's my take.
Okay. Okay, Abdullah is reacting. Thanks. Then we have a question from Simran Kaur. Hope that's pronounced correctly. You can also unmute yourself if you want to add something. The question is, how can renewable energy contracting be made amenable to grid planning, contributing to ecosystem services? Simran, you want to?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Good evening. Thank you so much for this webinar, because it really resonates with what I'm currently researching on, which is understanding how renewable energy contract contributes progressively to net zero goals while keeping in tune with the environmental safeguards. And this webinar absolutely touches on that note, because it talks about grid planning and land use planning. In revitalizing the role of grid plannings in contributing to ecosystem services. So I was just wondering if renewable energy contracts can also play a role in the kind of framework that you are actively working at the frontier, when it comes to grid planning expansion towards decarbonization.
Okay, I mean, I can take this. I can answer this maybe from the European context. I'm not sure what is in the US and other places. In Europe, we have seen a huge growth of renewable energies, and perhaps the role that grid planners have right now in this energy transition is a role that actually doesn't belong to them. And that may have been caused because of the huge development of renewable energy assets, that they have just grown too quickly, in my opinion, and they haven't taken into account all these things that we are measuring. But now that the grids are still even more necessary than ever, we're asking the grid planners to take this stride forward and to do use all these knowledge layers to bring back the value down to the renewable energy developers. So that's my view. I don't know if I explain myself very well. So I assume in other contexts, in other countries, it might be, it's lower penetration of renewables, and therefore the grid is more, I would say, more in order. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that explains a lot of underutilization. So thank you so much, Anika, and thank you so much, everyone, for answering this. Thank you.
Okay, great. We have two questions that are directly directed at Adrian. maybe for some of them, it's nice if you come back for a bilateral call or something. I'm talking about Haley, Dorian. And then there was a specific question about Scotland. Adrian, maybe if you can say it in one sentence, and then maybe offer to have a call with Haley.
Yeah, hey Haley. We looked into the Scottish into MacVitie's guideline. This is an overview of all the metrics used to map biodiversity, and we have seen reference to cultural ecosystem services in these recommendation, let's say guidelines or reports. But this is a bit outdated. It's from 2023, so I foresee that has maybe been some changes in terms of how the government in Scotland plans to capture cultural ecosystem services. But we can follow up bilaterally. Happy to do so.
Okay, cool. I mean, as time is sort of running out, I would actually like to ask one final question, unless there are more questions from the audience. So from all of you, first of all, thank you very much, Kim, Isabella, Megan, and Adrian, for this insightful webinar. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot because I did not know almost anything about cultural ecosystem services, only the things that Adrian taught me along the way. It would be interesting to understand from you. So if you could change just one thing about today's infrastructure planning process to better reflect cultural ecosystem services, like what would this one thing be? Is there like an easy straw that we can take? Like, is there, or what's the stepping stone? What would be your starting when we look specifically at the energy transition and increasing renewable energies? So who wants to start? It's also a reflection round. It's the final round. So maybe Kim, you have an idea?
Well, I just want to commend you and your organization. I think it's really incredible work that you're doing, and it's really challenging stuff. And the fact that you're engaging with it, I think, speaks very highly of the initiatives. But as I'm not working directly in infrastructure planning, I can't answer the question except to say that there's a lot of trade-offs one has to make in decision-making planning around any intervention. And I think if you're transparent with communities about those trade-offs, it's easier to then find sort of a middle ground that isn't a win-win-win, but there is scope for buy-in from local communities.
Yeah, thanks. True. And maybe Megan, one reflection from the US.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is like an easy, it's not necessarily a low-hanging fruit, but I do think that oftentimes we're quick to make assumptions about what would provide a cultural service or what people prefer. And I think just digging a little deeper into those assumptions is something that would be useful because what people prefer might not necessarily be what you would expect.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, your outcomes were quite surprising. Yeah. Isabella?
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess just to reiterate that it's important not to shy away from complexity, because if you do, it might sort of come back to bite you later. So, I understand that everyone's under time pressure, but taking that time and having those, early participatory deliberative processes are so important in this sort of in grid planning and any sort of landscape change. And just to also say thank you so much. I think it's been brilliant to that you've put this forward, this initiative, and I think it's fantastic work you're doing.
Thanks. Yeah, everyone, thanks for following us. Adrian, do you have one sentence and then I would close it?
I only would like to thank everyone, and I think this is a very important topic within the framework. And thank you for coming, the three of you here today. Thank you, Annika and Adriana, for organizing this and giving me this hand.
Okay, thank you so much. So for me, I have one takeaway that cultural ecosystem services are not an optional extra. They are actually something that we need to include and what we need to value in the future. So Thanks everyone for joining. Please join us on LinkedIn. We have a group on LinkedIn if you're interested in what GINGR is doing. We have a newsletter, and reach out with any questions you might have. We're always here. So thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon, and I would close the meeting now.